All right, well, let's get started. I want to welcome all of you here again today for what I think is an extraordinarily timely seminar and get-together with respect to not just in this country, but it seems in all the major regions of the world. For some reason, people are protesting, people are being stirred up by other people who are experts at this, and obviously
there's fine-handed extremists in almost all cases, and then we have the assaults internationally and here in this country with respect to law and other people who are trying to do their job and all that kind of thing. And so I think without further ado, Yonah, will get started. I just want to make one comment. Having had a lot of experience with the racial problems and challenges and the drug problems in the military in the late 60s and early 70s, and been in the middle of many of these kind of confrontations. And I noticed when I took over the command in Okinawa, and we had many racial problems and the like, and we were about to be thrown off the country, out of Okinawa by the Japanese government. My instructions were, whatever I do, forget about running a regiment, but get that camp straightened out or else. And so we knew from research, well, first of all, when I got there, I noticed that all the people were doing was riot control drills. There was no other effort going on. And so nobody was really looking at the root causes of all of these issues, no matter how complex they were and how difficult they may be. And one of the things we knew from experience is that most of the people who were absent without authority and deserters and the like in the military in the 70s were non-high school graduates, almost every one of them. And so one of the things we did, and mind you now, we have 55%, it's different today, but we had 55% of our people out of 8,500 did not have a high school diploma. And so we started a high school, and we put it right on the training schedule and the like. And the infantry was forced to go 1 week to school and 1 week to the field. And the captains, the commanders of the infantry companies, they all complained. They said they didn't have enough time to train and work with their people. And I said, you know, until I see you doing machine gun drill and mortar drill while you're waiting for the trucks to go to the central training area, they're going to school. And as long as you complain, you're now on the Parent Teachers Association, and you will get this thing. Go ahead and sell. And you'll go down to that school once a week and find out how your kids are doing and take those teachers to lunch. And so the point I want to make is within 3 months, you had blacks helping whites with homework. You had, mind you, on the base at Camp Hansen in July of 1974, it was unsafe for an officer to sleep without an entrenching tool in his cot. That's how bad it was. And then you had all the Okinawan Japanese problems thrown in there. You had riots, you had trouble at the gate every night, all of that. So within 4 months, that had been turned around. And you could go anywhere you wanted alone and not worry about anybody being attacked. And so the point I want to make is not to brag about what happened, but the point is it's essential that you get at these root causes, no matter how hard it might be, or how difficult, how complex. We've got to get at this, and we don't do a very good job of that, and we don't get a lot of help from the media either. But with that, Yonah, I'll turn it over to you here, and thank you, John.
Well, I'm not going to make a speech,
I'm sorry I turned it over
but General, I mean,
I made another mistake.
well, since actually we have this topic that Professor Azioni will teach us what it is all about, I think fundamentally we're dealing with leadership. And talking about leadership, General Gray provided leadership, and I would humbly suggest to read his book. We're going to present this book to Professor Azioni. It's either showmanship or statesmanship, and that's what we need around the world. Anyway, with that, let me first introduce our distinguished panel. You have the program. Okay. So again, Professor Etzioni, Amitai Etzioni, is a university professor and professor for international relations at the George Washington University. He has a very long and rich, I think, resume. You have all the details in the package that we distributed. I won't go into great details except to mention that it was my great honor and privilege and pleasure to meeting going all the way back to the late 50s at Columbia University when he came to teach there after teaching at Berkeley, for example, and elsewhere. And as many of you know, he was the president of the American Sociological Association, advised the White House on many of these issues, and contributed extraordinarily to our knowledge with many of the books. In fact, we do have some of the lists of some of his publications that we certainly should read and reread. One of them that we just try to distribute to you, and I do hope that you take again a second look at the rules of engagement and abusive citizens. So Professor Etzioni will be the first to provide a context for our discussion. Now, I would like to also introduce the panelists who will follow Professor Etzioni. Benjamin Haddad, who is a research fellow at the Hudson Institute, specializes in European and transatlantic affairs. He advised many politicians and government officials in France, for example. And our colleague, Pat Murphy, Professor Pat Murphy, who worked in the US government for many years as a specialist on Europe. He would follow him. And then Abraham Stein, who worked as a deputy secretary on security issues at the OAS, is going to deal with some of these issues related to Latin America. And finally, our colleague, Professor Dan Wallace, who is the chairman of the International Law and professor at Georgetown University Law School, will make some closing comments. Again, as the general indicated, because of the ongoing election campaigns in the U.S. and around the world, we are looking at this, what is known as populist politics. Clearly, we have to look at what it means, the definitions. But, for example, even the single issue concerns anarchism, nativism, nationalism, racism, ethnic, racial fundamentalism, and so on, relate to protests and extremism and violence. I'm not going to make obviously a long speech, but as an academic, I have a footnote, if I may, before Professor Etzioni will provide the broader context. In other words, I think we must learn from the historical lessons on the ethnic, racial, religious, political, ideological intolerance and violence around the world. Today is May 10th, on the calendar, May 10th, if we look at the historical record, May 10th, in 1427, which according to my math is 589 years ago, the Jews in Bern, Switzerland were driven out because of some religious motivation. They were the minority and they were not accepted. Then we move on to May 10th, 1682, 334 years ago. In Lisbon, the Portuguese Inquisition, they convicted 3 Jews who secretly practiced Judaism, and they're supposed to become Christians. They were put at the stake, the auto de fe, they were burned. And then thirdly, on May 10th, 1933, 83 years ago, in Germany, the Nazi party that really emerged, they encouraged people, ordinary citizens, to collect books and to burn them. Most of them were Jewish books. Students at that time, they participated in this act. They tried to bring some of the books from libraries. Also, publishers provided books. So they started with burning books, and then they continued to burn people. And we know about the Holocaust story. On a personal level, most of my own family, my wife's family, were killed during the Holocaust. So, are we going to learn some of the lessons? Again, we do remember what happened during the Second World War, and then the Nuremberg trials, and again we have to deal with the threats of terrorism and violence around the world. With that little footnote, I would like to invite Professor Yonah to talk to us a little bit about that particular issue, and clearly we have to continue to read his many contributions to our knowledge. Right? It's all yours.
Tricky place. If I may.
You may.
General, Yonah, panelists, ladies and gentlemen, if I had to summarize what I'm going to try to share with you in one sentence, is that we're trying to shape reality to fit our concepts rather than adapt our concepts when the reality changes. And that may be paying very heavy human and economic costs for insisting that reality must follow our concepts rather than adapt our concept to the changing reality. I'm going to give 3 examples of my point, all from the area of terrorism. I should say that this is not a criticism of the United States government. It's extremely common human condition, and the reasons are fairly clear. It takes a long time, a lot of negotiations and sacrifice and pain till we all agree on something. So then somebody comes and say, well, sort it out and use a different set of concepts. There's an enormous resistance. So let's take the first example. In discussing terrorists, we are caught in a dilemma that they have to be either criminals or soldiers. And so we try to fit them into one of those categories, and they don't fit. So soldiers is an honorable profession. We respect warriors. Soldiers assume there's a government to which they are accountable. So when they misbehave, there's a government that have an address we can complain to. Soldiers, the prisoners of war statutes apply, which we really give us great pain to apply them to terrorists. wars have a beginning and an end, and so when the war is over, we have to release all the prisoners. All bunch of things of rights and come, which makes it next to impossible to treat with terrorists in that category, and all the fuss about Jitmo is in part reflecting that we cannot detain him any longer. The Congress didn't declare a war. They don't fit in this category. Criminals is even worse. First of all, we have this odd idea that if a terrorist is in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Libya, we'll take a drone and take them out. The moment they land in Kennedy or even DCA, they just become Americans. So now they have all the rights. They're entitled to trials in a court. You can get them a fancy lawyer like O.J. Simpson got. We need to read them their Mirandas. And above all, when we deal with terrorists, our first priority is prevention, not prosecution. There are several reasons for this. First of all, it's a very practical reason. Many of these terrorists commit suicide. When people commit suicide, it's not really terribly convenient to bring them to trial after they committed a crime. They're not available. So you can't deter them by saying, all right, you committed a crime, I'll catch you and I'll bring you to court and throw you into jail. More important, after if a criminal will kill 2, 3, 4 people, it's bad enough, sometimes more. But if a terrorist will do what they did on September 11, it's much more important to us to stop it before it happened than to charge them later. Now, I'm not saying that terrorists have no rights. I don't think they should be tortured. It's depending on how you define torture. I don't think they should be detained forever. I think every year we should review their status. But basically, our mind should be large enough to allow for 3 categories. I mean, I see nothing in the Constitution or the Bible or even in the Quran which says we have to reduce our thinking to 2 boxes. You're either terrorist or criminal. The moment you say, this is third kind of being, then everything falls into place. They have certain rights. They don't have the same rights as terrorists, as criminals, or as children. We can detain them as long as they're dangerous to us, so we should review annually the detention. And that, I must admit, is not a small change in thinking, but it's unavoidable. We will need to surveil innocent people, because you cannot get prevention without surveillance of innocent people. That's exactly what the criminal law prevents you from doing, exactly what we need for terrorists. So that is one example, a fairly consequential one, about why we need to break out of this categorization. Now, the second example deals with sovereignty. And that is a particularly strong concept. We paid heavily till we got the understanding that one nation should not intervene in the internal affairs of another nation. We had religious wars, which finally terminated when the nations of the world agreed, sometime in the 17th century, that from now on no nation is allowed to use its armed forces to interfere in the internal affairs of another nation. So we now live by that. Then, sometime in the 1990s, a United Nations diplomat by the name of Feng, then in German, D-E-N-G, fed the following situation. There were people, a large number of people starving in Sudan, and the United Nations wanted to bring them food and medications, and the government of Sudan would not allow them to enter. And he was so pissed off by that that he simply wanted to send military forces there to insist that Sudan should be able to allow people to be fed and treated. And he wrote a book called Sovereignty as a Responsibility. And many years, there were several commissions such, and to make a long story short, 188 nations signed on the idea that governments have a responsibility to protect their people, known as R2P. 188 nations signed it, including China, Russia, and such, and the United States, which are usually not very quick to sign up. that technically meant that we start to make a dent in sovereignty. We said it's no longer absolute. It never was absolute, but we admitted that it's not absolute. And it said, in effect, that if a regime allows genocide to be happen or commit genocide, we have a right to send in armed forces. So this is the first major break in the notion that if we can interfere in the internal affair of another nation if it is not protecting its own people. That became an issue in Libya, because in Libya we started under the R2P by saying Gaddafi was about to kill his people in Benghazi. There was a point, very important for my story. As the rebels were moving and succeeding, Gaddafi said, okay, I want to negotiate. Maybe if we divide Libya in two parts. My people, my tribe will be here, you guys will be over there, or some other arrangement. And then the United States came and said, no, we want freedom, we want regime change, we want Gaddafi to go. At that point we changed from interfering in order to prevent mass atrocities to saying we want to force a different regime on Libya. That is the point where Russia and China said, wait a moment. And that is an issue today, because every time we talk to the Russians about stopping the war in Syria, and we want, as a first condition for Assad to go, they say, well, but that's regime change. That is not prevention. This is my background. But here I come to the next point. So now we have the situation where terrorists in country A attacking us or our allies in country B. And we start hitting them in the country A with drones or special forces and such. And they say, wait, sovereignty. You're not allowed to interfere in our space. And we accept that by apologizing every time that happens, or we try to hide it, or we pretend that we got the consent of the country. So in Yemen, we used to say that we have implicit consent of the government to hit terrorists in Yemen. In Pakistan, we said that we gave them notification, only was late in the mail, and so on and so on. All this, in effect, we acknowledging the notion that when it comes to terrorists, sovereignty is still solid and incontestable, and we need to restrain ourselves. In fact, there are many on the left who argue that all the drone strikes are illegal because we violate the sovereignty of other nations. So here is a suggestion I made here again. I think we need to change the concepts rather than try to change reality. I think we should create another duty of nations. And that is not only a nation has a duty to protect its own people from genocide, but they have a duty to prevent terrorists from their territory attacking other countries. I'm careful here. I'm precise here. I call it transnational terrorism. I'm not talking about terrorism in their own land against the government. It's up to them to deal with it. But the moment they send, or allowed to be sent, terrorists from their country to people in another country, from my viewpoint, it's not any different. They will shoot missiles from their country into another country. And therefore, we should create a new international convention which holds that if you do not stop terrorists from your country from attacking other countries, either like Iran does and did because you pay in finance and help them, like Saudi Arabia used to do, or because you are failing government and you are unable to stop them, as happens in parts of Pakistan, we have a right to intervene in your country to stop terrorists from attacking us. So there should be another limitation of sovereignty agreed by international law and norm that you cannot have it both ways. You can attack us through terrorists and then claim sovereignty when we attack you. My third example is by far the more important one and the most difficult one, I must admit, and it deals with the rules of engagement. And so basically we start with the assumption, which is vital, crucial to any international order, that civilians should not be targeted. Recall that during World War II, of course, the Nazis deliberately attacked London, not trying to hit any military sites, tried to hit civilian sites in order to break the spirit of the British people. They're not the only one who did that. I hate to mention the same breath, but we tried to set fire to all of Tokyo, and not because it provoked any terrorism, and there's something known as Hiroshima is in the news today. So out of that came a notion which existed before, the enormous revulsion against attacking civilians. And the first rule of armed conflict is the rule of distinction. The rule of distinction means that we have to do everything possible to separate the military from the civilians. Now we come to terrorists and don't fit that category. Why? Because a civilian during the day and attack us at night. Or they send them next to the road there with their shepherds, and when it's convenient they pull out an AK-49 or 47, whatever it is, and attack us or trigger a bomb. But our rule of engagement are still in the World War II mode. So, for instance, it's one point or another, and if you want detailed documentation, you find my article. Our troops in Afghanistan were ordered not to shoot until they're shot at. Now, I want to digress here for a moment. You gave me a very generous introduction, but now I have to add one more thing. I'm embarrassed.
Okay.
I did fight for 2.5 years. So for me, this is not in something, in my days it was called Commando, today it would be called Special Forces. So when I'm talking about what's like fighting, I'm not reading it from books. So, I do not want to go to war. I don't want to send anybody to war. I don't want ever anybody to send to war. If you have to go out there and you can't shoot until you're shot at first, that puts you at such an enormous disadvantage that I'm willing to say, if you're not willing to deal with the situation, don't go there at all. Yield, surrender, go away. Engaging in a war is a very nasty business. But once you go that way, once you see terrorists using ambulances to transport bombs, and once you see terrorists putting their guns on top of schools, once you see terrorists storing their ammunition in mosques, and then you say, I have in my document file, there's a 5.5-page single-spaced directive to U.S. troops. I'm not talking about CIA. What they cannot hit. You cannot hit a mosque, you cannot hit a school, you cannot hit a dam, and so on and so on. It's enormous credit to the United States that we have all these limitations. I'm not saying we always observe them, but that's what the troops are told. That's how can you fight terrorists when they don't play by the rules and you tie yourself by the rule? You think I'm exaggerating? 75% of the sorties over ISIS come back with their ammunition unused because we are afraid to hit a civilian. So, by the way, and that's a more difficult example to document. In Afghanistan, some of our generals felt that we should take some extra casualties, because if we don't hit civilians, then the Taliban is going to lose support and will shorten the war. So while in the short run, we take some extra casualties because we're going to be so parsimonious about hitting back, but also we couldn't get up, troops could not get backup fire because a civilian may be hit. Couldn't get air support. As a result, by some statistics, and I would agree, the documentation is not complete, there was an increase in our casualties, but no change in Taliban attacks. And so these rules of engagement need to be considered profoundly. How they must be honest, is very difficult, because obviously shooting indiscriminately at civilians is not acceptable, and may or may not increase the recruitment for the other side. On the other hand, fighting in a war where one hand is tied behind your back is simply very unfair to our troops and increases our casualties. This is not a small claim to make. Just to think that I may be slightly exaggerating, General Petraeus asked one of the strongest human rights advocates to go through the troops and to see what's happening, because he was so proud about how careful we were to protect Afghan civilians. And she came back and reported to him that the troops who overinterpreted the instructions were so demoralized that she, as a human rights advocate, felt that they had to be given a little more leeway. I'm going to give you a feel how far those rules of engagement went. And here, I admit, I'm leaving you with a dilemma. On the one hand, as I said, hitting the civilians indiscriminately is just going back to barbarianism, to what we had in World War II. On the other hand, fighting under those rules of engagement seems to be one of the reasons we're not doing very so often. If you compare what the Russians are doing with their airstrikes to ours, you see where they have more effect. They never heard about those rules. So I very much looking forward to discussion, and I hope to take with me as I leave a solution to all these problems and new rules of engagement. But my basic point I want to go back to in closing here, we should not allow, by being locked in concepts, to sacrifice young men and women. We should realize that time has come to rethink that what categories terrorists fit in. For the Congress to pass legislation tailored to this third group, non-state actors, if you want to call them, which are neither criminals nor soldiers. That we need to tell nations that if they house or support terrorists, there be no safe havens. We should not apologize when we hit back, when we are hit trans borders. And above all, we need to have a very difficult discussion about what the rules of engagements ought to be. Thank you very much.
As I said, we'll present you the General Gray's
It's
book.
the biggest fear I ever got.
Right. At any rate, General Gray, perhaps you would like to ask a question now at this point?
No, I thought it was very good. If you're setting it up so that the fight is equal, there's something wrong with your tactics. Very good.
Yeah.
I agree. The rules of engagement are ridiculous, and they should be eliminated. They ought to leave it up to the young commanders, and they tell the young commanders, look, do the best you can. If you're trying to help people, then don't do anything that's going to harm them. If you can help it, and leave it up to them. And they're just as qualified to do it, and you don't need any rules of engagement. They ought to get rid of about 70 to 80% of the lawyers that are involved. Do you know that they have lawyers with every company and platoon now to make sure you do it right? So you ought to get rid of the lawyers. Go use their head. It's common sense. If you're over there trying to protect the people of this state, you're not going to hurt them if you can help it. Why would you do that? You know, that's they know that. So we don't need all that kind of thing. But you see, we have a bunch of people who really don't know anything about fighting or people. Don't get me started. Go ahead. Go to the seminar. Don't get me started. I could take care of the whole seminar right now.
Well, yeah, you can. So
no, that's okay.
that's fine.
Go ahead.
No, I think.
I agree with the professor completely.
Okay.
Just one line.
Yeah, go
Well,
ahead.
first of all, I'm very heartened that the General agrees, because again, you know what we're talking about. And indeed, there are lawyers reviewing every tape. The media keeps saying that we put people on the hit list and such randomly. There are 2 lawyers examining every hit. The problem is only leaving it to the local commanders is this backup. So when there are many incidences where they're called, where they're in terrible trouble surrounded by Taliban, and they're calling for a support fire from either artillery or from there, and didn't get it because they're denied, or they had to go up 6 levels, including all the way to the White House, to get permission.
Yeah, and it violates everything that we really have stood for many, many, many years in the military. It's ridiculous. It starts right at the top with the commander-in-chief's attitude.
Anyway, aside from the military world, We do have the so-called civic society and the role of humanitarian organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, how to protect the victims of violence, not only during wartime, but now also peacetime. We'll ask perhaps Professor Don Wallace, as a lawyer, and Professor Flo, do you have a question or comment at this point?
Well, actually, I'm going to speak as a movie reviewer when I was at college. I recommend a movie to you. By the way, is this live?
Yes, yes.
Good. Have you seen this movie? I didn't know we were going to talk about rules of engagement. I'm prepared to talk about Donald Trump and populism, etc. Have you seen this very good movie called Eye in the Sky? Yes. I really recommend it to you. It's about drones, and it's all about what Al Gray and the professor were talking about, the role of lawyers in part. Very interesting. Very interesting. And it's all about this collateral damage, etc. So I recommend it to all of you. We went to see it because my wife is a fanatic fan of Helen Mirren. When she hears the word Helen Mirren, she, like many other women, rush to that movie. This is a very good movie. Helen Mirren is a colonel in the movie.
Thank you, Don, for your suggestion. Clearly, you have to see movies in order to go back to reality. We're going to ask Ben Haddad to deal with that phenomenon from the European perspective, particularly, I guess, France.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Alexander. Thank you, Professor Etzioni, for your comments. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I have to apologize in advance because I have to leave earlier, but yeah, so I will also talk about the French Donald Trumps, the European Donald Trumps, and talk a little bit about populism, even though we can maybe talk a little bit about terrorism issues in Europe as well in the conversation, if you want, because obviously the two are linked. But obviously, as you've seen in the recent elections, we see a succession of victories and progress of populist movements, especially far-right populist movements, all over Europe. Most recently in the Austrian presidential election, where the far-right FPO arrived first. In the regional election late last year, in late 2015, the National Front arrived first in the elections in France. It's in the first round. It's the second time only in its history that it arrived first at an election. The previous time was just a year before. So you see this trend, the emergence of AfD in Germany, which had been in the last decade, the only country that was, for obvious historical reasons, kind of immune to this form of far-right populism that is already also arriving and reinforced today by the debate over Schengen, the refugee crisis in Germany and all over Europe, the terrorist attacks in France and Belgium. But I'd like to take a step back, maybe focus on the French example, which I think is interesting, the National Front obviously, which is interesting to not only understand the trend in populism in all over Europe, but also understand what's happening in the United States today. The National Front has been going through a transformation, a generational transformation over the last years with the change in leadership from Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was the founder, and Marine Le Pen, who's the current chairman, and who is today running ahead first in the polls for the next presidential election in the first round. It's very important to remember this. In the second round, the French electoral system requires you to get an absolute majority of voters. So there's a runoff between two candidates. So it's very complicated at this stage to imagine that she could win a presidential election, because moderate left-wing voters would vote for the moderate right-wing and vice versa. That being said, it's a huge progression since her father, for example, in 2002, stunned the French political establishment by getting 18% in the first round and 18% in the second round as well. She is polling today around the 30s, low 30s. So you can see the progression. I think one of the important things in this transformation, and I think we see this also in the United States, the National Front was founded in 1972 as a far-right movement, a traditional far-right movement. It was a refuge for Vichy nostalgics, for supporters of French Algeria, for former OAS, which is the far-right terrorist movement the French terrorist movement that operated in Algeria during the war, that tried to assassinate de Gaulle during his presidency. It was also, for various extreme right French movements, and for a long time it was a French movement. Then it started emerging in the conversation in the 1980s when it focused on immigration and identity with a very famous slogan that I remember. I could see the posters as a kid: 3 million unemployed, 3 million immigrants, here's a solution. So clearly capitalizing on the economic crisis, the rise of mass unemployment in France, and scapegoating immigrants, and then the European Union. But it still had clearly a right-wing, far right-wing message when it came to identity issues, when it came to Jews. Jean-Marie Le Pen has been condemned many times for his words on the Holocaust, on saying that gas chambers were a detail of history, on saying that German occupation of France was after all not so bad. His daughter has tried, she took the helm of the parties a few years ago. She has, in 2011, if I remember correctly, she has tried to what we call de-demonize the party. So now, this is mostly a communication strategy, obviously, because you have the same kind of establishment in the party, and she supported her father, even though they've kind of fell apart recently, but she supported her father during her whole life. So I wouldn't exaggerate the difference in what they truly, deeply believe. But what I find interesting is deep down in Le Pen's gamble, I would say, there is the idea that the right-left divide is obsolete, that it's kind of a fraud play by the elites on the voters, and basically the center-left and the center-right think the same thing. They all support free markets, they all support the European project, they all have supported some degree of immigration, and that she has an acronym for it called UMPS. PS is the Socialist Party, UMP is the right-wing party, so she calls it the UMPS system. And she has this view basically that it's not about right or left. She has a very socialistic, protectionist economic message, and I think you see this in Trump being much less fiscal and free market conservative than the Republican establishment. She is clearly a nativist when it comes to identity issues, and she's also not so conservative on social issues, or at least it's not as central to her message as it is to the traditional right. And she's trying to appeal to an electorate that it was not necessarily natural to the National Front, which used to thrive in very conservative constituencies like the southeast of France, the Marseille environment with high immigrant population. She's trying to appeal to disaffected blue-collar workers, especially in the post-industrial areas like the north of France, where she's been running for local office. And I think you see this emerging new divide in the French political conversation. You have the traditional right-left divide, but then you have another division, which is about open societies, basically. Europe, globalization. I've noticed that some columnists, some writers here in the United States, when talking about Trump, talk about the losers of globalization against the winners of globalization. And that is why I think if you take the American example, it's been so complicated for conservatives to try to appeal to voters against Trump by saying, well, he's not a true conservative, but Trump's strength has been to sort of shift that conversation to something else. See, it's not about being more or less conservative or being a pure conservative. It's about protecting American values, protecting its identity, protecting its economy. So shifting about openness to different degrees of closeness. I'd like to make a point about foreign policy when it comes to the National Front, which I think is very important. This obviously translates into a very anti-European, anti-American message, and thus becoming pro-Russian, which is a trend that you see on extreme left movements and on extreme right movements. The French National Assembly a couple of weeks ago voted only something like 50 people participate to the vote or voted in favor of this, but voted to ask the government to abandon the sanctions against Russia, and you had this alliance between the extreme left, the extreme right, and really the fringe, most right-wing part of the traditional right. So you see this sort of new reconstitution of the right-left divide over these issues, with a lot of overlap between the extreme left and the extreme right, at least when it comes to foreign policy and economics, and a very strong current of anti-Americanism. To give an example, for a long time, Marine Le Pen's foreign policy advisor, who was then elected to the European Parliament, was fired from the French War University War School, École de Guerre, for being a 9/11 truther. A 9/11 truther for questioning the official version of 9/11. He was then hired as Marine Le Pen's foreign policy advisor. So you still have this very very strong view. So then which translate into support for strong men around the world. Very strong support for the Assad regime, for Vladimir Putin. They have been rewarded by Russia afterwards with this infamous loan that was widely reported. But I think it's really important though to notice that it's mostly ideological. I don't think the National Front is not a Russian agent. It doesn't support Russia because it got a loan. It's quite the opposite. It was rewarded with a loan because ideologically it has this pro-Russian narrative. Now, I think one of the interesting things that is starting to emerge is that you now have political leaders in Europe, like Renzi in Italy, or young French economics minister Macron in France, who are sort of the exact ideological opposite of these populist figures, so transcending also the traditional right-left divide. If you take Renzi in Italy, the leader of the center-right is his interior minister, even though he's a social democrat. His two main opponents are the Northern League, which is extreme right, and Beppe Grillo, who is extreme left. So you don't have today a traditional center-right opposition to Renzi, and that is also sort of what Macron is trying to do by advocating a pro-European, pro-free market, social democrat message, transcending right and left, and trying to appeal to right-wing voters. So it's interesting to see this maybe deeper, longer reshifting of the European political divisions, which I think is very important, because despite the fact that in most of Western European countries today, right-wing movement, far right-wing movement are not close to getting to power, despite constant progress in the elections, they have taken control of the narrative. They have taken control of public conversation, and their opponents are on the defensive when it comes to issues like in integration or Europe. As you can see today, the partisans of an integrated Europe are very much on the defensive today, and what we see on the contrary is what's happening, for example, in the UK with referendums that hopefully will not be won by the partisans of Brexit, but a trend that is mostly negative. So little glimmer of hope for this sort of ideological reaction to this populism, but I think a broader trend that is worrisome.
Just one line. I think it's a completely excellent presentation, and it may at first seem there's absolutely no connection between the two. But here's where I see it. You again give us a very powerful presentation, where all concepts, right and left, prevent us from seeing the reality and dealing with it, because you locked into yesterday's concept and don't adapt to the reality. The second line is, in both cases, we have millions of people who have lost their homes, lost their savings, cannot send their kids to college, and saw that those who made them suffer got bailouts. These technocrats, liberals, don't give voice to that anger, and so it's not enough to have for poor market, all these things which are good or bad, you can argue about differently, but unless you give voice to the anger, and that I don't want to go on, but you see in our election it's not clear to me yet that if anybody wants to give a different expression to the anger which drives Sanders and Trump, that we have found yet a candidate who can give a voice to that anger.
I strongly agree with this. I think obviously the situation is slightly different between the United States and Europe, where, for example, you don't have the same issues when it comes to college tuitions or the housing crisis, the financial crisis is a big impact, but not so much on housing compared to the US. That being said, the question I think is, how do you give voice to the anger? You know, do you let the anger dominate the debate and do you become the candidate of anger, or do you recognize that the issues that are raised indeed are legitimate, and there's a legitimate fear when it comes to economic insecurity and security, by the way, on crime in general, but you try to frame them and you try to give, I would say, liberal and not liberal in terms of left or right, liberal in a broader philosophical sense, response to them. I think that has been the main failure of the French political establishment for a long time. Is, for example, the National Front has been able to thrive on the issue of immigration because no one else wanted to talk about immigration, because the issue had been hijacked in a way by the National Front. And I think that's also probably what, to a large extent, Trump is thriving on. If you take the example of the European crisis, for example, and the Eurozone crisis, the Euro crisis, and the Schengen crisis, they're very comparable. In both cases, we have created instruments that we brought at the European level because we considered that borders and free circulation as well as currency were more efficient, we would be more powerful if it was brought at a common level. But at the same time, we've never given executive authority, political powers to Brussels or to whoever to be able to, for example, have common budgetary policies and common control of the borders. So now, the way you look at it, you can have two different kinds of solutions. You can either say, well, we need now to give political power at the European level. We need to have a better coordination of economic and budgetary policies for the euro. We need to have stronger common control of our borders at the European level. Or you can say, well, it doesn't work, so let's revert back to nationalism. Let's revert back to national borders, which is the direction in which we're going today. I was in Brussels a couple days before the attacks in March. It's the first time in my adult life that I had to show a passport while taking the train between Paris and Brussels. I can tell you, it's kind of a striking moment. And same thing for the euro. You can say, well, we're never going to be able to have a common policy at the European level, so let's go back to national currencies. In a way, both options make sense. So then it becomes a political choice. It becomes a value choice. And here, I think, whoever manages to defend his narrative, it's about politics. Whoever manages to win this conversation will bring us in a way or another.
There, sociologists would differ slightly. You cannot transfer political power to Brussels without transferring loyalty. If people see themselves as citizens of nations and they give more power to Brussels, you're going to exacerbate the problem. So you really have to have, not such as they talk about the democracy deficit, but as a community deficit. There's absolutely no sign that Europeans are willing to do what the United States did only after the Civil War. After the Civil War, if you ask an American where you're from, he would say from Virginia. People's first identity was regional. The United States Supreme Court referred to the United States in plural after the Civil War. It's only after the Civil War we really became one society. I hate to say that you didn't have the war, or the right war, to bring to the fact that people are really not to see themselves seriously as European. Actually, those who see themselves European still don't vote for the EU. They see themselves European in some ephemeral way. So the transfer of loyalty all I'm saying is the European barometer, which measures attitudes, shows that they're increasing in the ideal of Europeanism, but not in support for Brussels, because the notion that you're going to have a supranational committee there ruling over your life is simply unacceptable. So in short, sadly, EU faces now only one choice: to scale back rather than to scale up. I'm sorry to spoil your day, but
no, but I think.
One more time, I'm very happy to be recorded, because if you name them have the bet, you want us to take, I'll take the other side.
But
That can become 10 years from now, you'll be less united, not more.
if we don't have any choice, let's just go home and watch television. I think
No, watch
I don't take bet. I try to promote ideas, but I think after the Italian reunification, which was led by elites, one of the leaders of the reunification said, "We've made Italy, now we have to make the Italians." So all of this doesn't operate in a vacuum. You have an impact on the narrative. It depends also who's the loudest in the conversation. I agree with you that one of the biggest challenges is to be able to transfer a public space, a political space at the European level. That doesn't exist yet because, for example, the European Parliament doesn't have enough power, and usually, it's especially the case in France, political parties don't take the European election seriously, so they will tend to send the people who have not won at national levels and that kind of stuff. But the question is, how do you create this? How do you have leadership that is able to transfer this conversation, this debate? But it doesn't happen in a vacuum. When European leaders, for example, national leaders of European countries, use constantly the European Union as a scapegoat to attack, to shift their responsibility, it's normal that there's a growing Euroscepticism.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I know that you're supposed to leave, so may I ask you one question? I think that the way you try to describe it, which is certainly accurate, there's an illusion, let's say, with globalism, to bring it back to the level of nationalism. But can you explain the seemingly contradiction that we see on the one end? Let's say the National Front, right wing, whatever you want to call it, clearly they are against involvement in internationalism. For example, that the French government is bravely, I would say, participating and cooperating in combating terrorism abroad, for example, in Mali and elsewhere in the Middle East. And obviously the National Front and the right wing, they want either to expel or to kill the Muslims. So on the one hand, if you want to fight, let's say, the Islamic State, then you have to support the international coalition to fight it. So how do you try to deal with that kind of contradiction?
It's an interesting question. The National Front, for the moment, has a foreign policy vision that I would say is very, as I said, very aligned to the Russian one, basically. For example, when it comes to ISIS in Syria, their view is to say we should mostly align with Assad's regime and fight ISIS and basically all of the rebel groups that are considered as Islamist. It is an interesting contradiction because, as you noted, the French government is actually taking a pretty strong stance when it comes to fighting terrorism, especially in the Sahel, in Africa, and in Mali, with a French intervention of the last few years that managed to displace Al-Qaeda from most of northern Mali, and also a pretty strong stance in the limit of the French current military capacities, which are very strained and overstretched already in Syria and Iraq. But I think the National Front would say it's not enough. We have to do more at the national level. We should do more when it comes to assimilation of Muslim populations at the domestic level. But the current government, which is a socialist government, has been on these issues has been already pretty tough.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to move on to Dr. Pat Murphy, who will focus more on the German case, I guess, and in general, the European context.
Well, my paper will probably serve as something of a complement to Mr. Haddad's paper. Populism in Europe. First, a couple of definitions of populism. From dictionary.com, any of various often anti-establishment or anti-intellectual political movements or philosophies that provide unorthodox solutions or policies and appeal to the common person rather than according with traditional party or partisan ideologies. Grassroots democracy, working class activism, egalitarianism. From vocabulary.com. At its root, populism is a belief in the power of regular people and in their right to have control over their government rather than a small group of political insiders or a wealthy elite. The word populism comes from the Latin word for people, populus. These days, the definition sounds familiar to Americans at both ends of the political spectrum. But in an oddly parallel development, populism is growing in Europe as well. The most important immediate example is perhaps the upcoming referendum in the United Kingdom on June 23rd this year on whether to stay in the European Union or not. Some time ago, Prime Minister Cameron promised such a referendum. He may very well wish now that he had not done so. In any case, the UK has always been had something of what people have called a love-hate relationship with the EU. It was the last of the European big three, France, then West Germany, and the UK itself, to join what became the EU. The UK has continued to use the pound as its currency, rather than joining the Eurozone, and has thus avoided the extreme frictions over the last several years among Germany, Greece, and other members of the zone. The British, even more than the continental Europeans, seem fed up with seemingly endless regulations streaming out of Brussels, the capital of the EU, with little or no real democratic controls. It is likely that the referendum will lose and Britain will stay in the EU, but populism is clearly at work in the run-up to the referendum. Recently, and in the context of the upcoming British vote, Jean-Claude Juncker, himself the president of the European Commission, which is more or less the decision-making authority of the EU's government, effectively took a bow in the direction of that populism, or what amounts to a reinvigorated nationalism. He stated, "I think that one of the reasons why European citizens are stepping away from the European project is due to the fact that we are interfering in too many domains of their private lives." He added that in many of those areas, individual states were, quote, better placed to take action and to pass through legislation. In one of the more bizarre twists of populism in continental Europe, a few years ago, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, after negotiating long and hard for a preferential trade agreement with the EU, turned against it just as it was being completed. In a perfect example of the concept of populism, thousands of ordinary Ukrainians took to the streets in downtown Kiev, in particular on the Maidan, to express their anger at Yanukovych. In February 2014, he was forced to resign and flee into exile under the protection of President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The new government worked out the necessary details, and on January 1st, 2016, the trade treaty went fully into effect. Ironically enough, just 3 months later, on April 6th, a month ago, the Netherlands, itself historically one of the leading trading nations of the world, held a referendum on whether to accept that very Ukrainian trade agreement, which was in part meant to tie Kiev more closely to the West in opposition to Russian pressure. The Dutch people voted 61% against the trade agreement, a populist reaction to the populist support of the treaty in Ukraine. There is serious doubt as to whether the referendum will have any real effect, as overturning the trade agreement would require all EU members to agree. Nonetheless, as the Washington Post correctly observed, what the vote was closely watched is a bellwether of growing mistrust and criticism within the EU, which has struggled to deal with a huge migrant influx and debt crises in member states, notably Greece. Juncker's comments about popular dissatisfaction with centralized EU rulemaking were proven correct. More generally, trade agreements seem to be bearing much of the brunt of populist opposition. For decades, the feeling has been that lowering tariffs through such agreements is a win-win for everyone. Lower prices for both the United States and for its partners, Canada and Mexico, in the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, for example. But there is now a reaction against such globalism. In the United States, both Donald Trump on the Republican side and Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side have emphatically reminded the U.S. public that there is one set of losers. American workers who cannot benefit from lower prices on foreign goods because they cannot buy those goods, since they just lost their jobs from their firm's production movement abroad. Populism and nationalism have had a powerful effect in the U.S. as well as in Europe. Currently, the United States and the EU are negotiating a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, or TTIP. The TTIP would further cut already low tariffs between the U.S. and the EU, but it would also reduce non-tariff barriers, or NTBs, which could include worker and safety rules and environmental standards. The U.S. administration is firmly in favor of the TTIP, as are the European governments. But when President Obama recently went to Europe, thousands of people protested the deal in Hanover, Germany, precisely in large part because of fears that lowering NTBs might well damage their rights as workers. And the TTIP is certainly the kind of international trade agreement with which both Trump and Sanders might very well vehemently object. Thus, in this case, unlike the Ukrainian EU agreement, there will be plenty of populist opposition to the agreement within the body's politic of both treaty partners, the United States and Europe. The trade issue is basically an economic one. The other, even more important problem is, for want of a better word, sociological. The arrival of well over 1 million refugees in Europe during 2015, perhaps 95% of them Muslim, and perhaps more than 90% from the horrendously war-torn country of Syria. There is also a language problem. Most of the refugees are Arabic-speaking, though a large percentage do seem to speak English fairly well. In many cases, in many ways, the arrival of so many quite, quote, foreign, unquote, people sets the stage for a further escalation of long-standing tensions surrounding Muslims in Europe. These tensions have contributed heavily to the shocks of Islamic terrorism in such locations as London, Madrid, Paris, and most recently Brussels, which, it again should be noted, is the capital of the European Union. Excuse me. Note that both trade and refugees are international problems, and specifically between the EU and other European countries such as Norway on the one side, and the rest of the world. Even so, citizens of EU member countries continue to react to these issues on a specifically country-by-country basis and not on a community-wide level. As the following paragraphs will indicate, populism, though found widely throughout the EU, still takes its basic specific forms based on old pre-EU borders like the one between Austria and Hungary. Based on a supposedly out-of-date nationalism, the ordinary European citizen's first loyalty is still to his own country, and not anywhere near the same degree to the European community as such, and by the same token, he looks to his own local national capital for redress of grievances. Let us start with Germany, the EU's largest member. Last September, Christian Democratic Union Angela Merkel, Chancellor Angela Merkel, basically welcomed any Syrian refugee who wanted to come to Germany to do so without conditions. It did not take long for a strong backlash to develop against her humanitarian decision, not least by our own Bavarian sister party, the Christian Social Union, as most of the asylum seekers entered Germany through Bavaria, the country's most southeasterly state. Other countries between Greece, where most of the Syrians entered the European Union, and Germany soon began to crack down on border crossings by the refugees by adding various kinds of controls, though as Chancellor Merkel has never formally reversed herself. This past March, 6 months after Chancellor Merkel's welcoming statement, 3 state elections were held on the same day in Germany. Chancellor Merkel's party did not do very well, but exit polls showed that the 2 states of the old West Germany generally approved of her handling of the refugee crisis. The real shocker was that in Saxony-Anhalt, an eastern German state with high unemployment, The 3-year-old Alternative for Germany party gathered 24% of the vote. The AfD for Deutschland party's practical victory sent shivers down the backs of many Germans, as the AfD is clearly a populist party and frankly a nationalistic, rather extreme right one in a country particularly sensitive to such groups. Just how extreme is indicated by positions the AfD took regarding Muslims and Islam at its party conference April 30th and May 1st. Perhaps emboldened by its March electoral advances, the AfD stated, "Islam does not belong to Germany." It approved the ideas of prohibiting minarets and Muslim calls to prayer. Such prohibitions seem clearly against the German fundamental law or constitution. But the very discussion of such rather extensive controls on Muslims and the practice of Islam was both a populist reaction to the 1 million mostly Islamic refugees who entered Germany last year, and a challenge to the more centrist political leaders and parties in Germany. But of course, the refugee question continues to plague Europe as a whole. One reason the British are voting on possibly leaving the EU is the threat, as they see it, of having thousands of new refugees forced onto the British Isles. The right-wing UKIP, or United Kingdom Independence Party, continues to make gains, though on the other side, just a few days ago, London did elect the Labour Party's candidate as the first Muslim to act as a mayor of a major European capital. In Austria, a member of the right-wing party recently won the first round for the largely ceremonial position of president, presumably in part because of his anti-immigrant position. Just yesterday, May 9th, the Austrian chancellor, a social democrat, quit because, he said, members of his own party were questioning his leadership, specifically in connection with the asylum seeker issue. The formerly communist Eastern European countries are taking a hard line against accepting refugees, presumably at least in part because they're relatively poor themselves. On May 3rd, the Hungarian Supreme Court agreed to the Hungarian government's push for a referendum in which its citizens could vote to refuse the Brussels EU authorities' efforts to forcibly resettle in each European Union country, some of the tens of thousands of refugees. One day later, the EU itself announced it would fine countries which refused to accept refugees by 250,000 euros, perhaps $288,000 per migrant. It is doubtful that the EU could ever enforce such a distribution of asylum seekers among its 28 members, much less squeeze over $250,000 per refused immigrant out of such countries as Hungary. This is especially the case given the continent-wide growth of the very us versus Brussels populism which we have been discussing here. The new conservative Polish foreign minister said of the Brussels fine for refugee plan, it sounds like an idea announced during April Fool's Day. As we noted earlier, the growth of populism in Europe seems to parallel the growth of a populist movement in the United States. The elites or establishments of both areas will have to begin to take into account the negative side of globalism and international trade, for example, where vast numbers of people have lost their jobs because of those jobs moved overseas, at least partly due to the removal of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and not just because of lower wages in China, for instance. If such global trade is to continue, greater efforts will have to be made to retrain and take other measures to alleviate the situation for affected workers. The other important cause of the growth of populism in both areas, large-scale immigration, will also have to be dealt with. This includes both the 11 million illegal aliens estimated to be in the United States and the 1 million plus refugees who recently entered Europe in the wake of the Syrian tragedy, and for many non-Syrians, because of the need for decent employment. The lack of the elite's interest in curbing such migration goes a long way toward explaining why populism, that us versus them mentality, has suddenly arisen on both sides of the Atlantic. For some members of the elites, it means cheap labor, for others possibly votes, and for Angela Merkel and others, it appears to be truly a matter of conscience. But not everyone can insulate himself from the results of such migration, whether it be lower wages and the dilution of their votes for American citizens, or rape and sexual harassment for the young women of Sweden and Germany. If the elites wish their middle and lower class fellow citizens to back off populism and renewed nationalism and accept such large numbers of immigrants, especially Muslims at a time of widespread Muslim terrorism in Europe, the establishments will have to start examining their own positions and making some sacrifices, including psychologically, that of a degree of condescension and moral superiority.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Incidentally, Dr. Murphy's contribution is going to be also included in our next publication.
Oh, good, yeah.
And yeah, the refugee crisis and all that, which is coming out later this month. Anyway, let me ask you a question quickly because we have to move on to our next panelist and develop a discussion with the audience. My question to you is, how do you deal with the challenge now in terms of the deal that was made between the European Union and Turkey in regard to the deportation of some of the refugees back to Turkey, and in light of the recent development, the Prime Minister in a way was fired by Erdogan.
Not to speak of comments by a German comedian about the Turkish president.
Well, that's the question. I mean, especially in regard to the efforts by Turkey to become a member of the European Union. In other words, 80 million Turks are going to be part of United Europe.
Well, my own immediate reaction is that the Turkish deal probably should alleviate somewhat the pressures against the refugees in Europe, or what I call it populism in Europe, because some of the refugees will be sent back to Turkey, and they're paying the Turks, I think it's $3 billion on top of the $3 billion they promised earlier, $6 billion altogether, to take these people back and take care of them, which is, I mean, the Turks should be compensated for doing so, for God's sakes. But Erdogan's movement towards what sounds like a, I don't know what they call it, I'll just call it authoritarian position, is certainly an unpleasant development, and Angela's willingness to enforce a German law that was probably put in the books 30 or 40 years ago to protect occupying powers leaders like America, England, France, and so on, from insults by the German press. To enforce a law like that against a German, not the Turkish citizen who made fun of the head of Turkey recently, is a very bad sign. But she probably felt she had to do it to keep Turkey in line with this other deal, of accepting more refugees. And I'm not sure, but I think the rule is to be a refugee only counts until you cross the border of the country from which you're being a refugee into, we'll say Turkey. Once they're in Germany, for instance, or just crossing over to Greece, they are just as much illegal aliens as Mexicans crossing into the United States, as far as I know. I mean, they're not treated that way. Of course, we treat our illegal aliens pretty well too. But I don't think they have any kind of legal status once they get into Greece. And some of you just saw the article yesterday about how since the Greek transit method is gradually being closed, now a lot of them are going back to the old-fashioned way, going from Libya to southern Italy. And there was a picture on the front page of the Post yesterday, or somewhere in the Post, of Austrian cops enforcing a fence. It wasn't clear to me whether they were Italian opponents of the Austrian closure of the border, or possible Austrian opponents who were in favor of letting more refugees in. I think it was Italian, but I'm not sure. Anyways, things are tightening up on the Austro-Italian border since the Greek situation has been largely closed up. I believe that Greece does not have a common border with any other EU country. That's something to take into account. So they walked through places like Macedonia and so on, which were not members, I guess, at least not yet, of the EU. And in some cases, were probably flown out to the EU countries. But the numbers that I read, I think maybe it was in the article yesterday, continue to be exceedingly high for people trying to get from, we'll say, generally speaking, Syria, but it means also Afghanistan and even places like Eritrea, which are especially the ones from Africa coming up through Libya, to Europe. Those numbers don't seem to be slacking off much. And it's going to be a mess for quite a while to come.
Thank you very much. We have to move on to a
Yes.
style
Thank you very much,
that will develop
Professor
itself.
Alexander. After listening to these presentations and interventions, I am afraid you're going to think I'm going to sell you tickets, tourist tickets, packages to Latin America. You know, a lot of things are going on in Latin America. As you remember when street protests forced Guatemala's president to step down last fall during the corruption scandal, it seems a rare break in a long and lucrative tradition of impunity in Latin America. A lot of people thought that Latin American, or at least a Central American spring begun. Well, yes and no. Today, in Latin America, democracy has become the norm. Cuba is the only dictatorship remaining. The authoritarian regimes of Venezuela, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Bolivia are on the defensive. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, El Salvador, Uruguay, Nicaragua, Peru, and Mexico, as well as many others, are ruled by democratic governments. And those democracies, despite the deficiencies, tend to be more liberal than conservative. It is hard to imagine a military coup taking place, but we have to remember Honduras. Also, in contrast to the 1980s, today human rights are much mentioned and we are more likely to hear about civil rights, but still we have a very long way to go on the implementation of the rule of law. Corruption has become a key issue, a very important issue, as demonstrated dramatically by the events in Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, and Mexico. The political context is very different than it was in the 1980s. As for example, women have significantly expanded their influence in politics. Bachelet, Kirchner, Chamorro, Rousseff, and Chinchilla are clear examples. At the same time, women increasingly occupy leadership positions below the level of chief executives in both the political arena and the economy. Latin American populism is at the end of its recent cycle of popularity. In Venezuela, the death of Chavez gave away the disastrous administrations of Nicolás Maduro. Bad economic policies threatened the expansion of social rights, while political rights and the existence of an independent press continue to be, well, non-existent. This combination of crisis and repression makes President Nicolás Maduro's regime more akin to a classical left wing of authoritarian regimes. In Bolivia, Evo Morales suffered a historic defeat in the referendum held last February 21st, in which he has seeking the support of the citizens in order to pass a constitutional reform that would have enabled him to run again in 2019 for a new presidential term ending 2025. This is the third consecutive defeat for parties in power in South America in recent months. The first being defeat suffered by Kirchnerismo in the presidential elections in Argentina in November, after 12 years in power, and that of Chavismo in Venezuela's legislative elections on December the 6th, after 17 years of exercising absolute control over the National Assembly. Everything appears to indicate that the new economic cycle is characterized by marked economic slowdown, especially in South America. Citizens' weariness with the long administrations, many of which have been in power for more than a decade, and the attrition that they have suffered as a result, in addition to the new demands for more transparency and accountability, repudiation of corruption, and the demand for better quality public services, are giving rise to the beginning of a new political electoral cycle in which, in contrast to the recent past, change and alternation in power are now carrying the day. What does appear to be clearer and clearer is that the winds of change and alternation of power are beginning to blow more forceful in the region, especially in South America, and that the age of hyper presidents is winning down. People are increasingly informed, empowered, and demanding. They are exercising their right to vote and participating in non-violent mobilizations in the streets. The use of social media is
placing clear limits on the efforts of these presidents to centralize their power and attempt to remain in power indefinitely. Nonetheless, I would like to be careful in this analysis. We will have to wait and see the developments of the United States political arena during this election. Different results could trigger scenarios difficult to predict. Consequently, the importance of monitoring the next presidential elections very closely, not only those in the United States, but the ones that are scheduled in 2016 in Peru, Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua, but also those to be held in 2017 and 2018, in particular in Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and Venezuela. In Venezuela, if the Venezuelan elections are not called earlier as the result of the current economic crisis and the clash of the branches of government between executive and the opposition. Only after these elections and in the light of the results, we will be in a position to better understand the characteristics and trends of the new political electoral cycle that is emerging in Latin America. In addition, we cannot ignore the economic and trade partnership that just took effect. The Pacific Alliance members countries, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, welcomed the entry into force of the additional protocol of the framework agreement signed in Cartagena, Colombia in February 2014. This protocol is a fundamental commercial tool to move toward the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people among the four countries. The agreement provides tariff liberalizations of 92% of trade in the Pacific Alliance, as well as the liberalization of the remaining 8% in the short and medium term. Its objective is to achieve free movement of goods among our countries in 2030. The protocol, in its 19 chapters, facilitates regional trade, removes trade barriers, and establishes modern disciplines with regard to the professional, maritime, telecommunications, and electronic commerce services. The Pacific Alliance is an example of a forward-looking integration initiative whose goals are in line with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP. 2015 proved to be a rewarding year for the United States in many respects with regard to Latin America. That said, not all news will be good news for Washington and Latin America. Despite the formal normalization of ties with Cuba, the United States is unlikely to fully lift its embargo on the country in 2016, since the move will require congressional approval in an election year. At the same time, the Venezuelan opposition latest win will not mean that Caracas suddenly becomes friendly with the United States, though deeper economic cooperation between the two is a possibility if Venezuela's financial climate continues to deteriorate. Elsewhere in Latin America, major powers such as Brazil and Argentina will seek closer ties with the United States to stimulate the sluggish economies. Again, the political constraints and cultural differences will keep this from translating into a full adoption of a US-style open economic system. But then again, to complicate things, like many Mexicans and a lot of people down south think that Mr. Trump's aggressive rhetoric and alarming xenophobia would result in a disastrous relation between the United States and Latin America, especially with Mexico, and we will see. That's all.
Okay. Well, that's plenty. Thank you. Obviously,
Pacific Alliance.
your presentation triggered a lot of questions and issues. The debate in the U.S. of the elections, I'm not taking a political position, but for example, that Trump declared again and again that if he wins, he's going to build a wall that Mexico will pay for it. Will Mexico pay for it?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. First of all, there is already a wall. I mean, there are fences and walls with electronic devices and with the Border Patrol very, very active. And there is a full cooperation between the Mexican government and the US government in immigration issues. In fact, They are implementing a very important program in the border, in the southern border of Mexico with Guatemala. And they are sealing basically that border, trying to, to stop the immigration from basically Central America, Honduras and El Salvador. And as you know, the social and cultural difficulties that they are facing are great. So saying that you're going to build a wall is contrary to what I just said on the TPP in these trade agreements, where globalization is becoming the most important thing. I don't think Mr. Trump is going to build anything.
Okay, one more question, and then we'll open it up for discussion with the audience. The next question is, we always assume that if there is a common challenge and danger, this can bring nations together, as we have seen it, of course, in Europe during the Cold War with NATO and so on. Do you think the challenge, for example, of the health security cycle is going to bring the Latin American countries together in order to deal with that particular challenge?
Well, yes, no. In fact, they are already coming together toward the PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, and they are working together from not only from Brazil, from Chile to Mexico, on trying to diminish the impact of the Zika virus. You see, Latin America, because of the cultural issue and the social issues, they don't like to go ahead and provoke, let's say, domestic debates in the United States. They are waiting to see what's going to happen in the elections, and then I'm sure we're going to see a group reaction toward the OAS or toward UNASUR or to the LAC system. I think regarding the Zika and security, crime, terrorism, trafficking arms persons, Latin America is going to be more organized to give a front on that.
Okay, we'll open it up for discussion with the audience. Of course, Professor Azioni will have the opportunity also to respond, General Gray, and Professor Don Wallace. Dr. Raffaele, could you identify yourself, take the mic?
My name is Nimrod Raffaele, I'm with Memory, and I have my second question to Professor Azioni. The first one I made back in 1964 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'm sure you'll forgive me if I don't remember the exact date like John Alexander, who goes back to the 15th century.
I don't remember the answer either.
Huh?
I don't remember
That's okay.
the answer either.
Yeah. My question is, how do you apply the rule of engagement in the case of human shields?
It's an excellent question, and allow me to delay the answer by 1 minute. I measure the weight of a meeting, how long it takes us before we get to Donald Trump. And this was a very serious meeting because it took us more than half the time. So
It wasn't easy, but...
Congratulations. And finally, so all of you can relax. I have it on very high authority. If Donald Trump gets elected, he will leave us after 2 months for a younger country. Your example is extremely appropriate because that's basically what's happening. I mean, technically, we talk about human shields only if they take women and children and put in front of them, as happened in Sadr City in Baghdad. But it's really not that different that when, as this movie showed you mentioned, if they put a child to play in front of their building, and they know now they are completely safe, they can make bombs or whatever they want, because as long as they're a child, they're completely immune. I'm not saying we should go bomb childs. I'm just saying we need to understand the full depth. What's happening is much more common than this actually relatively rare example, where they technically line women and children in front of them as they march forward. The whole thing is one of human shields. I deliberately didn't mention another example because I don't want to get all the other complicated issues regarding Israel. But the situation is Hezbollah is like this. Hezbollah now has 140,000 missiles. They recently got advanced targeting system from Iran. The previous ones were not so well targeted. Most of these missiles are in private homes. It's the same issue, right? So you go back to the question, either you allow, when they get a signal from Iran, to bombard now most of Israel, some of them can reach every place in Israel, or you start bombing residences. So I don't have an answer to it. But one thing is clear to me. You can't, if you want to engage a war, you cannot engage it with the assumption that anybody who puts a skirt in front of them are immune to counterattack. I don't have a solution. I'm just saying we need to discuss it much more. I believe we need to give the civilians warning and let them evacuate the area. The latest war in Gaza, the civilians were given 3 chances. They were first called by phone, then they were given leaflets, then there was a missile without explosive, and blood was knocked on their building, so to speak. As a result, they evacuated, but they also evacuated the fighters. So even this way, it turns to be a very, very challenging issue. But the last thing we can do is simply retreat into the old concepts. Civilians now, they are immune, even affect their fighters who just don't wear a uniform. My last way of putting the same point, I have in my mind a uniform test. I ask myself, if they do exactly the same thing but wear a uniform, would we bomb them? Of course. So just because they took off the uniform, they suddenly become immune, it doesn't make any sense.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you, gentlemen, thank you for all your wisdom here. We're talking a lot about right wing.
Can you identify yourself?
Yeah, my name is Greg Soter, and I'm here just voluntarily to fill some time. I work for the Office of Director of National Intelligence and Systems Resource Analysis. So I'm with the ODNI. And I'm in between big studies right now, so I have a little time, and I come here once in a while for a little intellectual nourishment.
Provocation.
I'm sorry?
Provocation, intellectual.
Yeah, nourishment. Anyway, let's look at the radical right-wing movement for now, because we talked about it here about Europe and stuff. Let's peel the onion back a little bit, and we all talk about terrorism and that. And instead of just talking about terrorists, let's look what General Gray said about root causes. The root cause of the present wave of terrorism is a radical Sunni movement, not radical Islam, it's Sunnis, who are right-wingers. They can't deal with change. They can't deal with modernization, with globalization, and their expression of that in an authoritarian government was quashed. So they resorted to violence. They became insurgents. So I don't like us to keep saying terrorists, terrorists, terrorists. We're dealing with insurgents who are rebelling. They're right-wingers is what they are. And they happen to manifest themselves, and we just call it terrorism. And we tend to use that term too liberally without going to the root cause. So I'd like to get some of your feelings on that. It's a Sunni movement is what this is.
How many hours do we have? No, I have to leave it too. Anyhow, here's a whole bunch of issues in there. One is, I don't think there are many other countries who can deal with the modern world. I can say this, it's not just the Sunnis. I don't think Hungary or Poland, certainly many.
Yeah, my argument is it's the right wing, the conservative wing that can't deal with change.
Right, but do not all become violent. So, for me, the line should not be drawn if you accept liberal democracy, human rights, and such. My line should be drawn if you use violence to advance your beliefs.
Right.
And we did a very, very long study. If anybody's interested, send me an email to show that if you come to Muslim countries and say, would you support human rights, if you don't support women and such, you're going to get a very small sliver of support. If you come and say, are you against violence, you get the overwhelming majority in all Muslim countries. So just even on tactical reasons, it's very important to us not to equate moderate with a liberal democracy, American style, separation of state and church. So that's one way of responding to it. I very much agree with Michael Hayden. He's one of the smartest guys I've ever owned. And he made this observation that ISIS is different here. Because ISIS wants to have a state.
Yeah, they're Kurdish.
And therefore defeating their state will have a beneficial effect. If you, the other terrorist, you take away their territory, it means nothing, right? So therefore they cannot really be hurt a lot. They lose some of their leaders, they regroup. ISIS would lose a lot if you take away their state. And if I have to go for another second, there's, from all the things I follow, this one completely escapes me, completely. It's not a small thing. I claim I understand most things. This is a group of 40,000 people at most. Many of them are recruits from different countries, speak different language, different cultures. I once commanded a unit like this, and believe me, it's like herding cats. When they don't speak the same language, they have no experience together. It's very difficult to fight. They have no Air Force, they have no Navy, they have very little, and we treat them as if they were world power. There's China, Russia, and ISIS. The president gave 4 national addresses from the Oval Office, 2 dedicated to ISIS. I would have delegated to an Assistant Secretary of Defense. We cannot beat 40,000 people who run around in pickups. And so it's just beyond my comprehension. That would be a long weekend for us. Now, to emphasize, we learned that we lost the ground wars in Asia, and therefore no more boots in Asia. This is completely wrong. It took us 3 weeks in Afghanistan to defeat the Taliban. It was largely a fight was done by Northern Alliance, very few casualties. What we lost is trying to make them a democracy. We stayed there for 15 years trying to make them into Switzerland. We defeated militarily in 3 weeks. Saddam took us 4 weeks. And then it took us 3 more days to find out they had no nuclear weapons. We stayed for 15 years, caused at least 250,000 Iraqi death, not because we couldn't defeat them, it's because we wanted to make them into Romania. And so if we go out to ISIS, not as we say now, but we no longer talk about democratizing, we start to stabilizing. That will not happen. We cannot stabilize Syria, but we can defeat this caliphate, which would have enormous benefit. So we should not confuse war with nation building. We won the war and lost the peace, not because we are bad people, but because, go back where you started, some parts of the world are not ready for democracy building. Last sentence, we always compare it to Japan and Germany. We did, that's not interesting. What we did in Germany and Japan was, after all cessation of hostilities, not in the middle of a war, okay? These were nations which had a very strong sense of national unity. No tribalism, no Sunni-Shia, no Kurds. These were nations who already had a middle-class industrial and educational base. Any sociological attribute of Germany and Japan are missing in the Middle East. So the notion that we can do a Marshall Plan, so in short, if we just look at the reality and get away from all these concepts, we should take ISIS out in 2 weeks, and then what we did so successfully in '91, go home.
Not as easy as it sounds.
Come to my good slaughter.
Okay, we certainly can continue with this, not only the Sunni-based violence of the Islamic State or the Al-Qaeda, but Professor Sioni mentioned specifically the Hezbollah and their action and the inspiration and the support of Iran and so on and so forth. Even if we so-called defeat ISIS, you would have to deal with the other kind of challenge and so on. But we're going to ask Dr. Norton only to ask a question.
Well, I'll change the subject just a little bit. In connection with populism, there's one sort of reality, period of reality that's entering into the picture. They're called branding. I mean, Well, how does that fit in? Now, Donald Trump is a brand. Before the elections, he created a brand. How is that going to, is that just going to be a fly-by-night thing, go away, or is it something new that really has an important impact? Will you please comment on that?
Now, also the same literature on the effect of labeling. So initially there was this idea, especially in Harlem, if you label kids as minority or failing, then they failed, and if you told them all they were terrific successful, they're going to make it. It turned out the data doesn't quite support it. Labeling makes a difference, but not nearly as much. Then George Lakoff wrote a book that the conservative did so well by labeling estate taxes as death taxes. And as a result, there was enormous popular support against estate taxes. I doubt that people loved estate taxes before they were called death taxes. The Democrats then decided that they're going to play the same game, and they're going to call expenditures of the government, which the libertarians and conservatives don't like, they're going to call them investments, and then people are going to eat them up like cupcakes. Well, it turns out that the libertarians don't like any expenditures by the government. So labeling has an effect, but can be easily exaggerated. But I want to go back to something you mentioned a moment. Part of it did not get a lot to discuss, and maybe deserve no other panel, is Iran, because the notion that if you're going to make nice with them on the military, on the nuclear side, then they're going to become much nicer. It's with the proxy wars they're doing, turns out not to be the case. Now we may say, and there is an argument, that we should write off the Middle East, we no longer need oil that much, and it's anyhow a fucked up place. I'm sorry, a mucked up place. But if you do, as I did recently, you go and talk to the Koreans, to the Japanese, and to Taiwan and Japan, they pay a lot of attention to what's happening in the Middle East. And they're basically saying, you can send us all the freedom of navigation assertions and all that theater, but if you're going to abandon your allies in the Middle East, allies you for the last 60 years, put your hand in your heart and said, these are our closest allies, we're not going to rely on you to defend us. So what's happening in the Middle East is not Middle East over there, Asia is over there, we don't need to worry. There's a very deep connection. So I don't see any sign that this administration is willing to deal with Iran's proxy war, and we'll see what the next administration will do.
Okay, any in the back, please.
Yeah, Rebecca McCauley-Lynch, I'm a research associate here at the Potomac Institute. My question has to do with respecting sovereignty or holding sovereign governments accountable whenever we live in an information age where people are recruited across borders for ISIS, and borders really don't mean what they used to whenever it comes to electronic warfare, cyber warfare. So if the panel could comment on that, that'd be great.
It's a wonderful question, because it was a big man started, and so I appreciate it especially. See, we the United States adheres to the concept of national borders very, very strictly. And so when we try and pursue, the Taliban used to do this. They used to have breakfast in Afghanistan, attack us at lunch, and go back for dinner into Pakistan, and they were safe because they were behind the border, and we always pursued them up to the border, like it was electrified, and we were very reluctant to pursue them, and we apologized every time, or we tried to hide every time we did. They didn't acknowledge it. So they made the same idea. They attack, they benefit from Western recreation, their base, and we say it's a holy border. Or recently, dealing directly with the Kurds. The Kurds are one of very few people in this area who fight well, and our side, and a very trustworthy and reliable ally. They're not going to ally themselves with Iran. During the only years we were in Iraq, we went after Western recreation. We went to the Kurdish areas. But we were extremely reluctant until very recently to give them arms, because the government in Baghdad would not give us a license. Again, this concept, it's a unified state, there's a government, we have to go through the government. So we need to put all this behind us and to read with the reality that these borders were drawn up by colonial powers. They need to be redrawn. We need to give the Kurds independence and support them. And so all I'm saying is, your point is very well taken. Borders, respecting them is yesterday. Terrorists, if a country either uses terrorists as its army, the way Iran used to do, or cannot deal with them, this is a failing state, means from my viewpoint that sovereignty is fictional, because sovereignty means you control the area, and if you either use it to attack or you can control it, you no longer need to respect your borders.
We have time for one more question, please.
Hi, I'm Paul Sires. I'm also here with the Potomac Institute. My question is a little bit away from the terrorism question and more to sort of the populism movements in the U.S. and Europe. It's a question of time frame. The rise of Trump, not to get back onto him, but he represents a rather, it has surprised many people in politics as to how quickly things seem to have shifted, and in Europe as well. Are current powers able to move fast enough? What is the time frame that we're looking at, that if we find an answer that seems to be working, how quickly can it work? And how quickly will that be fast enough to counteract the rise of these new shifts?
Well, Europe, they're different European countries, and they did it very, very differently. France does not lose a lot of sleep about the rights of terrorists, and Germany tears its hair out. So there are very, very different reactions from all kinds of historical reasons. Sweden looks at it one way. Spain doesn't even notice it happened. And any sign that they come together, I mean, they are approaching the point that they may share information. You fly from one country to the other. And so they have a long, long way to go before this requires constitutional changes. This is not just that a committee will make, you know. So they are well behind the time. I really have to leave, and so let me just thank.
Okay, remember, we'll let you leave, the three countries so far. Dan, do you want to make some quick?
Well, a few words. Yonah's panels always have an awful lot in them. I think this one had even more than most. I'm a Republican, but I will confess that we should not vote for Trump, as Michael Gerson said this morning. Dr. Essione talked about reality, and I think that, of course, is crucial. One thing was not mentioned today was the contribution of the social media to reality, which I think is basically sort of made the world move towards sort of you could almost say sort of a mob-influenced reality. Going back to populism, in a way, comparing to Latin America, we're really talking about the discontents of the more advanced societies in a way. Dr. Essione used the word concepts. I'm a lawyer, law professor, and I would say the problem is as much structures as concepts in the European, the EU, etc., even our own political system. And I think this is relevant because concepts suggest a failure of intellectuals. Some of us are at this table, but structure suggests, and rules as engagement, a failure of leadership, and I think political leadership is the real crime. That's my own personal view. Secondly, one interesting thing about nationalism, so many of us were influenced by sort of the Marxism of the past, which thought that nationalism was over. Well, that isn't true. The EU thought nationalism was over. I don't think we'll ever have a United States of Europe. We might have a United Europe of States, which de Gaulle once mentioned. I don't think that is realistic at all. Trade is very unfair. We blame trade. I'm a free trader. And of course, it's technology and rampant consumerism. Consumers want all these things. And free trade, of course, there are losers. I don't mean Trump, I consider one of the biggest losers of all, of course. But I mean the people who will suffer with those. All economists know this, and we haven't done enough in the way of domestic adjustments, and we should. And we shouldn't panic. We can't talk about ISIS and Iran and all those things. I do think one thing, I love coming here because you learn a lot here, but I always come as an optimist, and I always want to leave as an optimist. And I think one of the dangers in talking about things too much is you become too pessimistic. It undermines will. If you don't have will, you can't be a good Marine, and I think we should all end up being good Marines. It's another reason I come in here, because General Gray kind of always puts it right, and I hope he will continue to do so. Secular, secularum, you know?
Okay, General Gray, it's all yours. Very good. No, I think it's great. I think we ought to put well on a high here. I agree. We shouldn't be a pessimist about any of this kind of thing. And you talk about root causes and this and that. If you really want to look at it in concepts and so on, you have to have a strategic thought process, a plan. And then you do away with those things that get in the way of the plan. And if we have to, for example, if you're going to go to root causes, you're not going to defeat a Sunni movement without going to the root cause of Wahhabi and what it means and who's funding them, like Saudi Arabia and all that kind of stuff. It's got to be a total picture here, and so we're not going to win the whole thing at once. We have to bite off a little bit of the apple at a time. I agree with you. We ought to get rid of ISIS, and that shouldn't take too long, and so on, and then take care of some of these other problems. You know, the Iranians and Hezbollah. Hezbollah's a natural enemy. We ought to take care of that too. But we have to be careful. They've got a lot of capability and a lot of money, and you can't get rid of Hezbollah until you get rid of the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and also get rid of the people in Iran that support them, and so on. And Russia has a stake in that. It was a Russian Soviet fuel-enhanced explosives that destroyed the French and the American headquarters in 1983. So it's a lot of people involved here, and we had to take them one or two at a time. And I agree. The rules. Well, let me write the rules of engagement.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for that.